Good evening, friends. I'm Dr. Abhinav Pandya, founder and CEO of Usanas Foundation. We are back once again with our Usanas dialogues. And today we are going to discuss a very, very important and a critical issue. That's anti-Semitism. We have an amazing professor here, a very distinguished and accomplished academic who has tried to define and explain this whole issue of anti-Semitism in a very unconventional manner and in a very nuanced manner. We are very honored to have Dr. Leah Greenfeld with us here today. And my colleague Preeti Khenta will be giving a detailed introduction of Professor Leah Greenfeld. Dr. Leah Greenfeld, I must thank you for joining us today. And I must say that today we are in a very critical and very transformational phase in the world order. And particularly when we see in West Asia, Israel and the Jewish community is facing a threat from a very ruthless and a very primitive ideological forces and they have unleashed a very brutal reign of terror on civilians and basically which is rooted in the idea of a very exclusivist Islamist ideology which cannot tolerate the existence of anything other than them. I mean, in India also, this is something which is very similar to our situation also, and we can relate to the situation in Israel also. Recently, we had a brutal terror attack in Jammu and Kashmir in Pahalgam, which is a very famous tourist spot. And the Hindu pilgrims, the Hindu tourists were killed because of their religious identity. The Islamist terrorists belonging to the resistance force, which is a proxy group of Lashkar-e-Taiba, again a Pakistan-sponsored terrorist organization. They killed the tourists, before killing them, they asked them their names, they asked them to take off their pants and just to verify their religious identity. So this was an act of a very brutal terror act. I guess Israelis are also facing the same. Being an analyst in the security affairs, I've gone through Hamas charter, and I mean, I can understand and I can actually see how this hatred emanates from very scriptural sources and some very historical sources. Okay? And in my experience in Jammu and Kashmir, I've interacted with a range of militants, are operating there, and they belong to several terror groups sponsored by Pakistan. And in the very first conversation, they say that their first enemy is Israel. India comes after that, and they say that it's a religious duty for us. And, I don't know what sort of a poisonous and a very venomous propaganda they've been fed, and perhaps we need to get into the details to understand this phenomenon so that we can come out with much better and effective strategies to tackle this. So, without wasting much time, I'll request my colleague Preeti to introduce you, and then we'll to request you to start the session with your opening remarks. Then we'll get back to you with the Q&A. And I'll request all the participants to mute themselves.
Sure.
Thank you. Over to you, Preeti.
Yeah. So, Professor Leah Greenfeld is a university and professor of sociology, political science, and anthropology at Boston University, USA. She is an Israeli, American, Russian, Jewish, interdisciplinary scholar engaged in the scientific explanation of human social reality on various levels, beginning with the individual and ending with the level of civilization. She is the author of Mind, Modernity, Badness, The Impact on Human Experience, Harvard University Press 2013, and other books about society and culture, including Nationalism, 5 Roads to Modernity, Harvard University Press 92, and The Spirit of Capitalism, Nationalism and Economic Growth, Harvard University Press 2001. Yes, thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you, Dr. Leah.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Indeed, it is very important to speak about this issue, especially to an Indian audience, for many reasons. Let me introduce the subject briefly. Antisemitism is all forms of hostility or hatred to the Jews as a group, that is, as a race, a religion, a class, a state. individuals in this case are not seen as agents, but as embodiments of the group agency. And because they are not themselves agents, but just embodiments of some larger force, it is justified to hate absolutely innocent people who even theoretically cannot be guilty of anything. For example, babies. If the individuals are seen not as agents, but just as embodiments of the group agency, then it is perfectly justified to kill babies. Individuals are not hated because of what they do, but because of what they are. Thus, it is a totally irrational sentiment, and it cannot be justified rationally. So, when Hamas or Palestinians say that they simply react to certain action by Israel, this is not what their hatred is about. They hate Israel or the Jewish community for completely irrational reasons, not for what they do, but what they are. This irrational Jew hatred, which we call antisemitism, exists for over 2,000 years. And from the Western point of view, it seems ubiquitous. So it is a continuous for 2,000 years, targeted hatred, and there is no other like it in the world. It is therefore a unique phenomenon. Occasional hatreds may be explained by the historical context. Somebody attacks you, and so for a while you hate this somebody. But the continuous targeted hatred, especially the one that lasts for 2 millennia, is explained psychologically because it casts through particular historical context, depriving them of causal significance. The only historical context that matters is the one that has created the psychological dynamic of such hatred and leads to antisemitism. Now, addressing the Indian public specifically, it is only now, with greater attention paid to the civilization of India as different from others, and the Chinese civilization. It is only now, with the concept of civilization, when we pay attention to those other civilizations, it becomes possible to understand and explain antisemitism. We see that our civilization differs from the two other great civilizations, yours and Chinese, because it is monotheistic. It includes all the Christian and Muslim societies. Neither Indian civilization and Indian society, nor the Chinese civilization and Chinese society have indigenous anti-Semitic tradition. And observing this difference, this allows us to connect anti-Semitism to monotheism. How does a continuous targeted hatred, by definition irrational, emerge? It emerges when some community observes another community and freely chooses it as a model, when it wants to acquire some essential characteristic that this observed community possesses and the observing community doesn't. So it freely chooses another community as a model, like the Christians and Muslims chose the Jews, and therefore assumes those observing communities assume about themselves that they are inferior to the observed community, which means that it is superior to them, and they want to imitate it. They, of course, hope that they will imitate it and will achieve equality with this community. Unfortunately, there is a possibility, very likely, that they would be unable to imitate it, unable to achieve such equality. They want to become like this model community. They want, in fact, to become it. To change, they must change their identity to acquire the desired characteristic. If they are unable to acquire this desired characteristic and be recognized by the observed community, by their model, as equal, they necessarily develop a complex of inferiority, like a pathological complex, a sense of being permanently inferior to the model. This necessarily leads to existential envy and hatred, something that you in India call manas rog. It is a mental disease, a very serious mental disease. And this hatred becomes a constant irritant and stimulant for violence, because the life of people suffering from the complex of inferiority makes no sense. They're very uncomfortable in their life and meaningless, unlivable. Violence, however, gives its purpose, meaning, and makes it enjoyable. There is, we can talk about that, but there is this wonderful example in Mahabharata, the example of Ashwatthama, that kind of illustrates this point. So what happens in the monotheistic civilization? 99.9% of the monotheists, their monotheism, all the Christians and Muslims, their monotheism is not theirs. It is not original. It is borrowed. And this is what gives rise to this complex of inferiority, leading eventually necessarily to anti-Semitism. Every anti-Semite is an inferior, envious being full of hatred, suffering from a mental disease. In the Muslim world, 80% of people are anti-Semites. So take this into consideration. they feel permanently inferior to the Jews unless they deny their identity as Christians and Muslims. They must be anti-Semitic. They must claim that Jews are very bad Jews, so bad that the new Jews, Christians and Muslims, the new worshippers of the Jewish God, were called into being. Now, specifically regarding India and what you started the conversation with, such a complex of inferiority is a self and order destabilizing mental illness. It is expressed in hatred, which is always fomenting. If its original target is unavailable for attack, or if another group intensifies this complex of inferiority, this hatred may become generalized and can be temporarily redirected. For instance, the West in the last 500 years has been very successful in many respects, and so it also intensifies the Muslim complex of inferiority. Thus, you see constant hatred of the West in the Muslim world. India, you had a very long period of being subjugated by Islam. Your very liberation from this subjugation intensifies Muslim complex of inferiority. There are no Jews in your area. There are no Jews in Kashmir. But Muslims naturally would be violent towards you because they hate you. They hate you because you increase their complex, you intensify their complex of inferiority, and they have no other target for violence. Now, it is very important for you to understand that those are people who are moved by such targeted, irrational violence towards another group. What they do is irrational. It has no, you don't have to commit any action on your side so that they would be provoked. They're provoked by their very existence. But it is very important for you to understand that you are dealing with inferior human beings. It is not a judgment on your side. It is what they think about themselves. And if they think this about themselves, then who are we, others, to argue with them? They, after all, know themselves the best. So it is important for you to realize who you are dealing with. You are dealing with inferior, envious, hateful beings, humans who are filled with irrational hate. So I think here I will stop with my introduction and let you ask the question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leah. Your exposition and your analysis of anti-Semitism through a psychological and sociological lens is eye-opening for us. And I think that, I mean, this is something which is a very deep-rooted mental phenomena. And I guess I agree with you. This kind of hatred is a sign of a mental sickness. It's a disease, you know. And in your lecture, you mentioned that monotheism in the West is borrowed. Can you say a bit more about it? I mean, why do you say it's borrowed, and from where have they borrowed it?
Well, they borrowed it from Judaism.
Judaism.
The monotheism began as Jewish monotheism, as the religion of the Jews, as Judaism. This is a very attractive order creating belief. It makes the world logical and predictable. You have, of course, the Brahmanic religion of India is also very perfectly order creating. But we are talking about very different area of the world, which which wasn't very much in contact at that time. We're talking about the very beginning of the Common Era. Your example was not present, but the Jewish example was present. And various pagan people who had their own gods, but at the same time, those gods didn't provide them with a sense of order. They lived in a very psychologically messy environment. They didn't allow them any possibility of predicting and knowing for certain what they should do under any circumstances and what would happen to them. They had absolutely no feeling of control over their life, such as the Jews always had, with this one controlling God, and such as you have with your religion. So they were very attracted to this idea of one God, the creator of the universe. And both in the case of Christianity and the case of Islam, they became believers in this Jewish God. What does it mean to have a God, the only force that gives meaning to one's life, that organizes one's life, gives order to one's life, that determines one's identity, just as your beliefs determine your identities? But your beliefs are your beliefs originally. They're your beliefs for 5,000 years that you exist. The God in whom Christians and Muslims believe, who is supremely important for their life, is not theirs. they borrowed it from the Jews. And this is completely recognized in all the scriptures, both in Muslim scriptures and in Christian scriptures. This is the God of the Hebrew Bible that they borrowed. And what is Hebrew Bible? Hebrew Bible is the history of the Jewish people. You see? So they worship the God of the Jewish Bible. And this is what the Quran says. And this is what the Christian Bible, the New Testament says, right? And how do they explain that? They are worshiping Jewish God, but they're not Jews themselves. How do they explain it? They explain it by the fact that Jews actually must have betrayed this God. They must be very bad Jews. And this is why new Jews, Christians or Muslims, were called into being. Right? So their very identity as monotheists demands that they become haters of Jews. And this is what happened from the very beginning in the history of Christianity. History of Christianity begins with the polemic against the Jews. This is how it's called. You know, from the very beginning, the most important, first, historically, the most important part of the Christian thought is explaining how horrible Jews are and how every Christian must hate them. And Quran introduces the same attitude in itself. More than 1/3 of the Quran is devoted to complaints and hatred against the Jews. Every little child who learns that, who reads the Quran or is taught the Quran, is taught to hate the Jews. You cannot, in Christianity, it took 2000 years, but finally the Pope had to say to the Catholic Church that this was wrong, that this was all a terrible mistake. This happened in 1965, right? But so many tropes were already created. So many completely unquestionable ideas have been already created that not every Catholic now, and very many Catholics, do not realize that the Pope, the papacy itself, declared that this was really very, very wrong. It was a terrible mistake on the part of the church. And in Islam, this never happened altogether. I mean, they still.
Dr. Lee, yes.
One.
Dr. Lee, I have a few other questions also. I'll just interrupt you here. And so regarding this only, I want to know, you mentioned that in Christianity, Pope told the Catholic Church that this was wrong and they rectified it. But no, just related to that, in the past, do we have instances of extreme and very brutal violence by Christian anti-Semitics? That something akin to this brutal violence which is unleashed today by the Islamists in West Asia and various other parts of the world against the Jews. This is my first question, and affiliated to that, would you like to tell us a little more about the European traditions of anti-Semitism? I mean, were they political or were they religious? And to what extent they influence the Islamist movements of the 20th century? I mean, the present Islamist movements.
You see, I insist on the influence of borrowed monotheism, and that because we are a monotheistic religion, we are the monotheistic civilization. Now, you live now in the 21st century, and one can observe how beautifully and how fast India is modernizing. And you have nationalism, which is a secular perspective, secular sense of community that was imported from Britain specifically and spread very wide in India, especially under the Congress Party. And yet, all of you, I am sure that even those of you present and I'm talking to, all of you still belong to the Indian civilization. That your existential experience, your attitude to life, the way you live is still reflecting in most everything this 5,000-year tradition, the tradition basically of Hinduism, of the Brahmanic religion, with everything that it implies. And it is the same with Christians and Muslims. You see, now many Christians are secular. Most Christian societies are now secular, but they still think in ideas that, and they feel, in the way that they felt when they were deeply religious. European anti-Semitism throughout centuries was very violent. There were constantly, for centuries, constantly everywhere. Those states, were independent. They didn't have to coordinate, but constantly over every single European state, there were mass murders, brutal massacres of Jews, and the Holocaust, which was incited by a secular government, was enabled by the anti-Semitism of all the European religiously motivated anti-Semitism of all the European states and the United States. This is why the United States didn't do anything to protect European Jews. So you see, it is this deep monotheistic nature of European societies, this deeply Christian, anti-Semitic nature of European societies that expresses itself today in this resurgence, in this explosion of anti-Semitism all over the Western world. You see, they always tried, both Muslims and Christians, they always tried to explain the anti-Semitism rationally. They always said, oh, this is because Jews do this and this and this, that we hate them. But this sentiment is irrational. They cannot attribute, if it were rational, they would be able first, then anti-Semitism would not be lasting for 2000 years. It would be defined only by specific historical context, very limited. But it cannot be defined by historical context. It is continuous hatred. And more than that, they cannot ever identify the agents. You see, they kill babies or they support killing babies. Why is the hatred for babies? Babies didn't do anything. They couldn't have done anything. Why do they rape and brutally rape women, young women who didn't do and couldn't have done anything? You see, their attempt to explain this rationally, it doesn't work. It's not a rational thing. Now, in regard to Muslim anti-Semitism, it is precisely the same thing. Of course, they use now, as they use with India, in regard to India, they use various rational arguments, you know. But this is all imagination. This sentiment and this behavior is not rational. It comes from within, not from the context outside. So I would say that today's anti-Semitism is not very different from yesterday's anti-Semitism, from the anti-Semitism as it emerged in the beginning of the Common Era, with the appearance of Christianity.
Thank you. So my next question, how is Hamas using Islamic scriptures to promote and spread anti-Semitic narratives? And with that, another related question. Do you think if in Islam also will there be a moment, you know, where they will realize that their whole history of anti-Semitism is wrong and they will regret, they will apologize? Is there any possibility of that revolution or that moment coming in Islam? I mean, if that happens, how are these so-called friendly regimes to Israel, like Saudi Arabia or let's say UAE, how are they going to reconcile with that, with the Islamic thought, which is, I mean, currently those scriptures are used by Hamas to justify anti-Semitism. I've already asked you a question to discuss more about those scriptures, how they use them to justify anti-Semitism, and also just to throw some light on the possibility of Reformation in Islam.
Well, your first question about Hamas, well, they're very open about that. in all their declarations, they simply use the Quran. The Quran declares that until all the Jews will be killed by Muslims, life wouldn't be livable for Muslims. They want to, they simply and very openly want to kill them all. And they declare that. But at the same time, they use today's ideologies, you know, the anti-colonialism and Jews as representative of the Western imperialism to attract to themselves the support of fundamentally secular Western societies. And they're very successful in that because the background of those societies and those supporters is either Christian or Muslim, even though they're secular, but they still are full, their brains are full of anti-Semitic tropes that they inherited from before. Now, 19th centuries, after the emergence of Christianity, the main authority in the Christian religion, the main authority of the church, of the Catholic Church, the papacy, after the Holocaust, they declared that all this theology and all this anti-Semitic preaching for 19th century, for 19 centuries was wrong. The Catholic Church declared that.
And Protestants also? What about the Protestants?
What?
Did they also declare?
Not
What about the
Protestants, but Protestants were, to begin with, there was something different. We can speak specifically about that, but there was something different. In any case, the Catholic Church, the main and the foundation of Christianity, they declared that this was wrong. But did it influence the populations? No, they didn't. It didn't influence the populations. You think about, there was incredible anti-Semitism in Poland, right? Well, it still exists. And today, there are, there are documentaries and people are interviewed. Why? How do you explain that the Holocaust, basically, the site of the Holocaust was concentrated in Poland, right? So they ask Polish people, so how do you explain that? And they still use the same tropes. They say, well, they killed the Christ. Who killed the Christ? Those babies who were burned in crematoria. Who killed the Christ? You see, it's not rational. It's still the same. Even though the church now says that this is not legitimate, the thinking remains the same. Now, about Islam. We live now the monotheistic civilization. We live now in a largely secular world. Our governments are very often rational rational. The princes of Saudi Arabia and of the United Emirates, they rationally understand that it would be good to have peaceful relations with Israel. It would help their states. In general, peace in the Middle East would be good for everyone there. Yes, so it is certainly possible that some rulers in the Muslim world who are smart people, rational people, they would try to reform their populations. Just like the Pope in 1965 tried to do that for the huge population of Catholics around the world. But Catholic Church did not succeed in that. Will the Muslim rulers, those who are rational among them, succeed in that? We don't know. It is possible that they would want to do that, just as the Catholic Church did it. But I don't know how they would succeed. I will tell you one thing that can succeed. And it is very important for India with its dealing with Muslims, just as for Jews in dealing with Christians and Muslims. The borrowed God create the borrowing of God, created the complex of inferiority in the upper strata among theologians and thinkers and leaders of Christianity and Islam. It is those upper strata that directly suffer from that, from this horrible complex that they are inferior. But it didn't really touch, you see, to begin with, the populations, because usually the populations, they just obey the rules, they perform the rituals, they don't think much about that. However, those leaders, theologians and thinkers, they were preachers and teachers. And in their preaching and teaching, they created tropes, constantly repeated attitudes, right? And those tropes became embedded in the consciousness of the population. You see? Tropes is an extremely powerful instrument, the most powerful instrument of institutionalization. Whatever is institutionalized is institutionalized by tropes, by forming people's ways of thinking. So I believe that one thing that can work in the case of anti-Semitism but also in the case of your Indian dealings with Muslims, is constantly repeating that these are inferior people by their own admission, without us criticizing them, that they know themselves to be inferior. They are mean people, full of envy and hatred. Repeated constantly.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Leah. In fact, I would like to thank you for your brilliant and a very nuanced analysis of this whole history, concept, and the mindset behind anti-Semitism. And I agree that the tropes play a very crucial role in shaping the subconscious mind of the people. And over time, even the secular governments and the people who are totally secular in their leanings, they tend to carry that historical baggage of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic tropes in a very unknowing manner. So I guess there's a strong need of an exercise at a mental level, at a theoretical and a philosophical level to challenge such notions. And in that regard, I think that definitely the Saudi, so the West Asian monarchies who are sensible and who have realized that the peace is a better option, and they can team up with the definitely senior Jewish leaders or maybe Indian spiritual leaders and also Muslim leaders, and they can work out a system to reform the scriptures. These things need to be analyzed carefully, and if something is not relevant and something is just promoting hatred and violence, then that needs to be eliminated, that needs to go out. And once these changes take place at a very theoretical philosophical level, then those changes percolate down towards it at the level of the society through new tropes and new definitions. And we look forward to that. World is in a very different shape right now. It's a transformational phase. We see a lot of geopolitical conflicts all around us. West Asia seems to be on the verge of a massive conflict, which looks very likely and very close by with every passing day. We hope for peace and a better future. Thank you very much once again for joining us today. We look forward to inviting you more often and also to reading your articles and papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.